Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I want to have a chat about content warnings. So as usual with these Sunday videos, I'm just kind of starting the conversation. Do let me know in the comments what you think on this subject. I think it's a really important subject and one that doesn't get talked about as much as I might expect it to on BookTube. Having said that, this video was partly inspired by a channel called Boozy Bookish Thoughts, who put up an excellent video on the subject in the last week or so. I did share that on my community tab and I'll put a link to it in the description for this video as well, so do check it out if you haven't watched it already. And also inspired by a comment in the last 24 hours or so on one of my videos where I talked about the book Let's Go Play at the Adams by Mendel Johnson. And somebody pointed out in the comments on that video that I probably should have given some trigger warnings for that book, and I don't think I did in that video. And I definitely should, because it's a very, very troubling book with a lot of very difficult material in it. So yes, I can't remember who left that comment now, but you are absolutely right. I should have done a better job of that. And I wanted to talk about this today because I do think it's really, really important. And I think it's important because if this channel's about one thing, it's about sharing different kinds of books with people and getting people into reading, all sorts of different books. So, on paper, the channel is about crime, pulp and horror fiction. In reality, I talk about, a much wider range of books than that. But I do often talk about books with, darker content. And I think it's really important that when people read books like that, they go into them with their eyes open as to the kind of things that might be in there if they feel they need that. So I'm not somebody who particularly feels like I need content warnings on my books. I'm fortunate enough to have had a life that hasn't had that much trauma in it, so I don't necessarily feel like I need those things. But I can think of at least one example in the past of a book I DNF'd because it had something in it that upset me, and that was something that was related to something very particular that was going on in my life at that time. That book was The Time Traveller's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger, which I subsequently, a few years later, did read completely. But at the time that I first tried to read it, as I say, I had some stuff going on in my life, and there was a particular section of that book that was just too much for me at that moment in time to take. And had I had read content warnings about that book, I would have known not to read it. And there's something a bit frustrating, isn't there, about getting 200 pages into a book, and I think it probably was about 200 pages with this book, and then having to give it up, for any reason, other than the fact that you're not enjoying it. So if you're not enjoying a book, then yeah, give it up, DNF it, definitely. But if you are enjoying a book, but there's something in it that is upsetting for you, then it's annoying to have put the effort in to get to that point of the book, which is the position I found myself in with The Time Traveller's Wife the first time I tried to read it. So what I'm going to talk about in this video anyway is why I think content warnings are important. Boozy makes some really, really good points in her video. So as I say, do watch that. And some of the points that I'm going to talk about here will kind of be retreads of things she said. But I particularly want to frame it in terms of discussions of like crime and horror books, given that that's mostly what the channel is about. And I think it's really, really important that all horror fans feel like they can read horror safely. And I think it's a thing that might feel a bit weird to some people, and certainly there is sometimes a perception in the horror community or a view in the horror community about content warnings that they're kind of for wimps, which I think is bullshit, frankly. What I think is that there are some people who, for whatever reasons, there are things that are extra upsetting for them. They may well enjoy the normal the normal pleasures of horror fiction, of being scared, of suspense, of disgust and horror. But there may be particular things that for whatever reason are just too much for them. And I think for them, content warnings are very important, and they help make horror an inclusive genre. So if people know that there are reliable sources of content warnings for them that they can trust, then they can go into reading, horror books with that feeling of security that they're not going to get particularly triggered on something. The other side of this is, I think, kind of discrimination in books. So I always, in my videos, so I will admit I could do a better job of, general content warnings. And I'll talk a little bit in a while about what I'm going to do about that on the channel. One thing I do always try and do is flag up like bias within books. So, racism, sexism, homophobia, because I think that those are things that you can do without fear of spoiling a book. So content warnings, I know some people feel there's a risk of spoilers. And I think that's why they do, whilst they're important, I think they do need to be treated carefully, because I certainly on this channel have a pretty strict no spoiler policy, and always try not to include spoilers in my reviews. But discrimination, I think, isn't a spoiler. Yeah, and a lot of the books I talk about on the channel are older books. So, for example, this month I've read a Raymond Chandler book, and in my review of that, or my discussion of that, I talked about the fact that there's a lot of racism in that book. Now, a lot of people will say, that's because of the time it was written, and that may well be true, but it doesn't stop it being racism. And Brian from Bookish did an excellent video about this subject the other day, which I will put a link to in the description for this video. It's well worth watching. But yeah, just because racism was rife in a society at the time a book was written and is representative of that society and makes the book true to life, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't call it out. Because the last thing I would want is for me to recommend a book on the channel and for somebody to read it and be, really offended by it because it was a book that contained discrimination. So I will always call that stuff out. And I know, I've had comments on some of my other videos from people who say I draw too much attention to this stuff. But I think it's really, really important to do it for the reason I've just said. So yeah, I think content warnings are important. And what I'm intending to do on the channel about that, because I'm conscious I could have done a better job of it in the past, is, so one of the things I'm doing now is for all of my main reviews, I also do a text review, which will be posted on my blog. And there'll be a link in the video description to that text review. And that text review right at the bottom, so you won't trip over them accidentally, right at the bottom will have content warnings. And I will try and do as good a job as I can of calling out the things that I think are, deserve a content warning in that book. So if you're somebody who has particular things that you need to avoid and you want to check those content warnings, then that's where they will be. But I am only human, so I may sometimes miss things. So apologies if I do. Another really good source of content warnings is a site called Does the Dog Die? Which I'll put a link to in the description for the video as well. So that's like a crowdsourced site with content warnings. I have thought about using that for my reviews and just putting a link to it in my, in the description for the video or in the review on my blog. The reason I'm not going to do that is because I'm a bit worried that the site will go under. It's like a crowdsourced site and it may well just cease to exist at some point. And if that happens, then my reviews will no longer have valid content warnings. So I'm not going to do that. I will rely on my own judgment and put those into the written review, but I won't mention them in the video review. What I will try to do is say in the video review if I think there are particular content warnings for a book. So I won't say what they are, but I'll say, I think there are content warnings for this book. Check out my written review if you want to see what those are. But do look for other reviewers, either bloggers or YouTubers, to get that kind of balanced view of content warnings. If it's something that you feel applies to you, and equally, if I don't mention content warnings for a book but you're concerned, do feel free to ask. So either ask in the comments or join my Discord and we can talk about it on there, or drop me an email or whatever. I'm always happy to to provide additional information about books that I've read if people feel that they need it. So that's what I'm going to try and do going forward. So I've started doing it already, and this is for my main reviews. It's not for every book I talk about on the site. I read a lot more books than I review. I normally do one or two reviews a week, and I normally read at least double that. So if there's a book, again, that I've talked about in a wrap-up, and I haven't done a review for, and you're interested in understanding content warnings for it, again, just reach out, and I'll let you know what I think. Okay, time for a random book from the shelves. Today's book is The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski, which is a book that definitely needs content warnings for, to be honest with you, pretty much everything. It's a really horrific book, and this is a book that's come up a lot in the comments on my review of their Heather Lewis book, Notice. A lot of people have suggested this as a disturbing book I should read, and I have indeed read it, and it was indeed very, very disturbing. So it's about a young boy travelling through kind of war-torn Europe during the Second World War and witnessing multiple atrocities. So yeah, a very, very horrible book, but worth reading in my opinion. I do think it's a good book. So those are my views on content warnings. As I said at the start, I think they're important because they make horror and crime and books generally more inclusive, because people can feel safe in the books that they read if they can find reliable sources of content warnings. So I would encourage fellow booktubers out there to consider, if they're not doing something around this already, to consider whether or not they could be including content warnings in some way in their videos, whilst trying to avoid spoiling books. Not always easy to do, but I do think it's important. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know if you find content warnings useful. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.